Welcome. For those that Paul, and I'm a member of the congregation here. Is it okay, Sean? Cool. As Dan's outlined already, so we're looking and exploring these three words for this series. And the first one that we've got is the word courage. And this Bible passage picks up an aspect of Moses talking and trying to encourage the Israelite people. But before we delve into the passage, I wanted to just give a bit of an overview of the wider story that's going on in this passage. Vince alluded to a bit of it just before we had the reading, but there's a bit of a backstory that I think is really important that we understand a bit. And it starts from actually this notion that throughout the whole Bible, really, of the fact that God is has a calling on a people and has a place for them to dwell and wants unity in relationship with them. And that's the kind of the story that's going out through the whole Bible. We see that in Eden, the story of Eden, when God has created, and we can see that the people he has called and created are living in a paradise place for him, and they've got that ultimate unity in their relationship with God. But that breaks down, and then we see the notion of our corruption, of the barrier of sin between us and our relationship with God. And the other bits of the Bible then explore how God is continually trying to engage with humanity in order to call humanity back to himself and to be able to restore a relationship and a people that are engaging and living in that relationship with him. We saw God calls a particular person and a particular family, Abraham, and gives a special covenant, a promise to Abraham to say, you and your family are going to live in a special place that then becomes Israel, and I'm going to be your God, and you're going to be my people, and through you, you're going to be blessing to all the nations around you, and that's what your promise is. And while you're living there, though, in order to continue to be under my blessing, you need to follow some of the guidance that I've given you in order to really establish this relationship so you don't become corrupted according to the ways of the peoples around you. And so what then happens is Abraham's family come, and then we're familiar with the story of Joseph. One of Abraham's descendants ends up in Egypt, and the Israelite people end up in Egypt, and they end up in slavery in Egypt. And then we have the story of Moses comes in, who leads his people out of Egypt through the waters of the Red Sea, and then out to a mountain where God again reveals himself to them and provides them with the law about how they should be distinctive and have a distinctive culture and identity compared to the nations around them. And then he leads them, as we saw in Moses' retelling, to the entrance where God wanted them to go forward into this land and to take it and to be able to live there. It was already being lived. Other nations were living there at the time, and God was promising to be with them as they went into that land. But they chose not to. They, as we'll explore later, their fear was too great. And so God then led them through the wilderness for 40 years, and then they've come back to this place. And this is now where Moses is kind of re-establishing that relationship, redetermining that relationship between God and his people, and to encourage them before they now step again into the promised land. The story continues, though. And the story continues because they entered that promised land, and there was years of blessing, but they never quite fully realized the blessing that God had for them. And actually, in the end, God, it's revealed about how God took them out of that promised land. And they entered years of exile and suffering, and they were continually questioning where God is this? What has happened to God's original plan? And that's where Jesus steps in. And through Jesus, we then realize that God has a new plan and an alternative way in which actually through Jesus, he continually calls us as a people, people that believe and trust in him. We're no longer a single nation. We're actually people within all nations. And he calls us, and there's not a single place. We are throughout the world. And actually, we're not in a broken relationship with God anymore. We actually have a fullness of relationship. And now this is where we are today, in this kind of new place and a new relationship with God. So that's kind of the big story, and where Moses sits in, and where this story that Moses is giving in Deuteronomy. Now, I'm aware that for some, the notion of Israel and God promising a land that's been given to other people and saying that he will be with Israel and telling Israel to go and conquer this land and be a land of blessing can be really difficult and can stir up a lot of questions about God's sovereignty and what God's really calling. And I'm not going to touch on that this morning. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One, it is a really complicated and complex issue, and I actually don't feel I've got the understanding to be able to deal with that well at the moment. But also, I actually feel that the message of this passage is actually a different message for us today, and so I don't want to spend lots of time on it. But if that is an important issue, then do come and speak to me, and I'd love to journey with you as we try to unpack and explore that complex issue. And I believe there are answers in and through it, but it will take a bit more time. It may be that Dan does it later. But what is really clear throughout the Bible, especially as we go into the New Testament and the Old Testament, what we can't do today and what we should never have done since Jesus' death and resurrection was to have in our own mind that God is calling a nation in particular to go forward and conquer other nations in acts of war in order to establish his kingdom. That is not the way in which Jesus and the gospel message is. As I said before, we are all to be able to have relationship with God. Our kingdom is where we walk, where we stand for God in our places. And our relationship with God is from heart to heart. So where do we then stand with this story? What is the purpose and the meaning for trying to read this story now when we talk about courage? Surely there's an easier New Testament kind of passage that we can engage with. But I think that there's a lot that we can unpack here. For some people, it can be quite literal. We heard of a member of our congregation who's come out and been called out of their country. They're now in our country and are seeking an aspect of peace and being able to enjoy the benefits of that. And our prayer is that they will really experience the peace and the joy of being in our country. Most of us, it's probably going to be more of an allegory tale, a story where we can actually see that the journey of the Israelite people reflects quite a lot our spiritual journeys. For some of us, we have been through periods of not knowing Christ. And for some, Paul uses the illustration of that's like slavery, being a slave to sin. Some of us have been baptized. We've been through the waters of baptism. And in times of our Christian journey, God leads us around to places. And I think what God's say to us, particularly at the moment, is that do not be surprised. God will lead us to places where we fear to go. However, let us encourage one another. Let us take heart, have courage, for God is with us and God goes before us. That's what I think the message of this passage is to us for this week. God will lead us to places we fear to go. However, let us encourage one another. Take heart, for God is with us and he goes before us. So let us just unpack that a little bit. Why did the Israelites not go into the promised land right at the start? We've touched a bit on that already. There was fear and unbelief. The fear came actually from a misunderstanding of who God is. And that was something that Dan touched on a couple of weeks ago. It says sort of in verse 27 brings this out, if you've got your Bibles. It says, "It is because the Lord hates us that he has brought us out of the land of Egypt to hand us over to the Amorites to destroy us." You know, they had a completely wrong understanding of actually the nature and who God is. But I know that that's so true for us, or certainly true for me. At times, especially when I'm finding life hard and life really difficult, I can sometimes think that actually God's just against me. You know, he's not really for me anymore. Especially when things seem to come not just once, but 3 times or 4 times all together. And you can just think, one thing, okay, God, but all this, surely you are against us. And it's often at times like that when I actually turn to a passage, 1 John in chapter 4, where it says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not reached perfection in love. We love because he loved us." And that section and that passage from John is really exploring that and actually turning it around, saying where we're fearful, often that comes from our doubting in who God is. But as we deepen and establish our relationship and our understanding of God's love for us, then the fear, my experience, doesn't disappear, but it melts a bit. It eases. It enables me to have enough courage to be able to step forward in spite of some of the fear that I've got. And then also with this, their unbelief in verse 29 to 31, they talk about the Israelites, or Moses explores that the Israelites sort of said that they feel that God is not with them. And that seems surprising, actually, because up until that point, God had, you know, according to the story, had plagues in Egypt that released them, that they got trapped by the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, and they thought that they were going to be killed then, but the waters were parted and they went through. So even they seem to have forgotten the blessings and the work of God in the past. And again, I know that that's so true for me at times as well, when I am fearful and afraid, that actually I forget the stories of the past. And that's one thing that's really important, that actually the sharing of stories from each other, actually journeying with each other, so that when we're like that, we can actually hear stories of other people, that we can get alongside and say, "Oh, but do you remember when God did this?" Or, "Actually, my experience has been when I've stepped out and done this, I've seen how God works and provides a miraculous intervention." And we saw that a bit in the passage as well, where the spies went out into the land and they brought back some of the bounty of that land. And I think that that's a calling for us as community too, to be able to share with one another our experiences and our journeys that build and strengthen and encourage each other. The other part that I wanted to draw out really was that God leads us only where he already is. Again, in that verses of 29 to 31, Moses talks to the Israelite people, and he said to them, Have no dread or fear of them, for the Lord your God goes before you. He is the one who will fight for you, just as he did in Egypt before your very eyes, and in the wilderness, where you saw the Lord your God carry you, just as he carries one child, all the way that you traveled until you reached this place. So God again was saying, even though he leads us to places of fear, that doesn't mean that he's not already gone before us, that he's not with us. in maybe what might feel like a dark place, he is standing with us. Even when we think that we cannot feel him, we cannot experience him, that actually God is still with us. Also, they weren't abandoned. And I think this is actually a really important one for us to explore. That when they went to that promised land for the first time, and they said that they didn't have the trust, and they then went and walked 40 years, God did not leave them to wander on their own. He didn't say, oh, you've not met my standard. I wanted you to do this. Now you're on your own. Off you go. What he did is he journeyed with that people through the wilderness. He provided them guidance with fire in night, clouds during the day. He provided them with manna each day so that they had daily food, and when they grumbled, he even provided them with meat later on. Even when we feel that we've stepped away from God's calling on our lives, he is still with us and continues to journey with us. That journey in the wilderness was really important for the Israelite people because it helped them handle and untangle the reasons why they couldn't step forward into the promised land before. Through that wilderness, God was able to establish and help them understand who he was, that he was a God who is with them and caring for them, that a God who goes before them. And he untangles some of their past hurts and their understanding and their fearfulness of who they were, that they were no longer slaves, but a nation called and under God. So where do we go from this passage now? I don't know where your place is, where you're at the moment. I don't know your specific circumstances. But coming back to the core thing of God will lead us to places we fear to go. However, let us encourage one another. Take heart, for God is with us and God goes before us. So it may be that you feel that God has currently led you to a place where you're fearful to go. You're uncertain about the next step. And that may be a physical step of where you're going, or it may be exploring past hurt, or disillusioned, like exploring further some of the stuff that we covered on that service on Wednesday. Or it may be that actually what God might be saying to you is actually you're a bit like those spies. Your journey of faith has been such that actually you've got and are able to communicate and share some of the blessings that you've received, and actually to encourage people in that place to step forward and to keep going. So it would be great to hear some stories of people encourage, and do share them with each other. This walk and this journey, God called an Israelite people, and he calls us as a community, as a church, to be his reflection and his representation in this world, and to bring and enable his kingdom to come. We're not here on our own. We're here together as a community. So let us continue to explore what this passage might mean to us. And let us be encouraged that God is with us and he goes before us. And often courage is not an absence of fear, but actually an awareness that God is with us, and that we can therefore step forward into what God has promised us, despite our fear. Amen.